welcome you to our event tonight. Since we're kind of short on time, I'm going to save the platitudes and boring talk for another time. So with that said and done, we've got two wonderful women here tonight, and they're going to have a very scintillating conversation. So the first person that I'd like to invite to come up is Dr. Michelle Taylor. She's Delaware's own. She's the executive director of United Way. She's coming. She'll be here in a moment. Now, like us, follow us on Facebook. I've got some more prizes. And I hope that you all will be a little bit more voracious the next time. Hey, the mask mandate ends. Oh. Excuse me. Oh, this is mine. So I think we'll have Dr. Taylor come up first. Well, I guess we got Angela Davis. Let's come back. Welcome. Welcome.
Is that okay? Yep. Hello. Hello. How are you doing this evening? Super excited for the conversation? Oh my goodness, I've been waiting all week for this. I am so honored to be able to moderate a conversation with Angela Davis this evening. And I know later on in the evening there'll be an opportunity for questions. I want to give a shout out to Network Connect. They sent me some questions, the young people, our young colleagues here, and so I will be including some of them. I originally said I wanted to make sure that she had a message that would inspire our young leaders, our future generation. And a couple people said, well, don't forget us, because she inspired us too. And so we'll try to make sure that we do both. So my first question, I'm just going to jump it off, that says, you're admired by so many people, young and older, as you can see. How would you describe yourself, and in what ways have you changed since your earlier days in the movement?
Well, first of all, good evening, everyone. It's really wonderful to be here in Wilmington, one of the very first public events I've done since the beginning of the pandemic. So I'm really happy to be with you. I don't know if I'm the best person to answer that question. How have I changed? I don't think I've changed a great deal. I've tried my best to hold on to some principles. And when I was 15 years old, I was a very ardent opponent of capitalism. And now I'm 78 years old, and I'm still an ardent opponent of capitalism. But I've tried to learn over the years, and I think that my sense of what it requires to build a movement, to bring about substantive change, has become a great deal more nuanced than it once was. When I was much younger, I assumed that that all you had to do was, organize the revolution. And those who did not agree with the revolution, well, they were just going to be left behind. And now I realize that it takes artists. It takes workers, it takes intellectuals, it takes performers, it takes all of us, not only doing the work that allows us to be seen as a movement, and that's precisely what demonstrations are. Demonstrations demonstrate the existence of a consciousness, a collective consciousness, a collective dream, a collective imagination of a different future. But the work of forging that consciousness happens in so many different ways. It happens in conversations, it happens in the classrooms, it happens through music and so forth and so on. So I've come to recognize that the deep changes are the ones that are encouraged precisely by music and art that make us feel differently, that allow us to feel what we might want to embrace before we really understand it. So, yeah, we could spend the rest of the time talking about that. But let me just say, I never really thought of myself as a leader, or some people call me an icon. I don't know. This is some people say legend, but I can't really identify with those labels, because I know that all of the work I've ever done has been with other people. I've never done anything by myself alone. And so I see myself as standing in for communities of people. And one of the reasons people know my name is because of the fact that people all over the world became involved in the campaign to free me when I was facing capital punishment 3 times, right? So I always have to ask people to remember that it wasn't so much what I did as it was what other people did for me. And I continue to try to transmit that message.
So you hit on it a few minutes ago. So when you think about the movements today of like Black Lives Matter compared to civil rights movement before, how would you describe the difference in the movements, if any?
Well, yeah, there are differences. And I just am so happy that I'm still around to be able to witness, what has happened over the last years. I met Patrice Cullors when she was, about 21 or something like that, before anyone knew her name. And I saw her at a conference, and I said, I'm going to give you my telephone number because I want to be in touch with you because you're going to do amazing things. This was before the creation of Black Lives Matter. It was when she was involved in an organization against sheriff violence in Los Angeles, and I was a judge for a foundation that was going to give prizes to activists from various parts of the world who were doing important work. But I look at her, and I look at all of the other figures in Black Lives Matter, and they know so much more than we knew, and it makes me feel so proud that we did the work that laid the foundation for them to emerge and as the metaphor goes, they stand on our shoulders. And the very fact that they stand on our shoulders means that they can see so much further than we could. So I'm an educator at heart. I'm a teacher. My last job was at UC Santa Cruz, and I basically trained PhD students. The History of Consciousness program where I taught was a PhD program. And as a teacher, I think it's my job to give my students the foundation so that they can surpass me. That is what I want to see. And that is what makes me happy.
What would you tell your younger self?
Well, I think I did it right. I don't, what I want to have happen is I want my younger self to remind my older self that I have to try to generate that kind of energy and that kind of youthful imagination. It's often assumed that when you are older, you are wiser. And of course, we try to be wiser. But young people are always at the forefront of change. And it really angers me when I see people who call themselves veterans of the movement, and all they want to do is to have the younger people replicate what they did. And I want to see them experiment and be creative and be involved in projects that we never could have imagined. And I want to be able to learn from that. So, getting back to that question, I can remember when I was in SNCC in LA, and I was in the Communist Party as well. And I can remember older people. Well, older people were in their 30s and and in their 40s, maybe 50s. But I can remember being really impressed by the older people who were willing to treat us as equals, who were willing to listen to our ideas, who didn't assume that all we should do is follow them. And that is a message that I would like to have my younger self tell my older self all the time, to remind me to be humble and to embrace egalitarian relationships with younger people, and to realize that it's also my time to learn. It's not simply my time to teach; it's my time to learn.
So, fighting for social justice against racism and inequitable practices can be totally exhausting. On some days you feel like you're taking 2 steps forward and 3 steps back. What do you do to get refueled? And what energizes you to stay on course? And what advice would you give to those in the room, right, that are still fighting?
Well, first of all, don't think of yourselves as individuals who necessarily have to do the work alone. We live in this capitalist society that encourages a kind of acquisitive individualism. And we are ideologically encouraged to imagine ourselves as these individuals in the world who should try to achieve great things by ourselves, because that's the way history is told, isn't it? It's the great man theory of history, and I think that what has helped me is the recognition that history is not changed by great individuals. When we see the most phenomenal transformations of history, they come as a consequence of large numbers of people embracing a collective vision and advocating and demonstrating that vision. Now, let's go back to May of 2020, when the largest demonstrations in the history of this country took place. There have never been so many people out in the street. There have never been so many white people demonstrating against racism. And yes, and that did not happen because some leader got up and told people to pour out in the streets. It happened because the confluence of events at that time, the witnessing of the police lynching of George Floyd and the police murder of Breonna Taylor, combined with the recognition of the structural character of racism that occurred precisely because we saw the damage that COVID was doing to black communities and indigenous communities and Latinx communities. And, you know, it occurred to me when those demonstrations happened. And by the way, people went out in the streets before they knew that it was relatively safe to be outside. So they went out not knowing whether their demonstrating with masses of people might mean that action claimed their lives. They did not know that. That was such an urgent collective impulse to say no to racism. And I mention this because that confluence of events probably caused many people to remember things that they've been hearing over the years and not necessarily responding to. Because I know, you know, people have been talking about structural racism forever. I mean, I can remember we were talking about the systemic and structural character of racism in the 1960s. And in the 1970s, we were talking about the prison as an example of the structural character of racism. But it didn't necessarily resonate. But the thing is that some of us kept saying it over and over and over and over again. And I sometimes tell people, I sound like a broken record. I'm saying the same thing for years and then decades. But then something happens. And you realize that that is precisely what you were supposed to be doing. You can't stop. You have to keep repeating, keep saying it, keep urging people to think. And then you're faced with this confluence of events, this historical conjuncture, and suddenly people get it. But you see, if we had not been doing that work for years and decades and 50 years, then there would have been nothing to help masses of people grasp what was going on at that moment. So, what was I talking about? I was talking about the way history unfolds and the transformative character of history that does not emanate from the pronouncements of individual leaders, but rather from masses of people. I actually remember what I was talking about.
So, what was the hardest obstacle you've had to overcome in your journey, and what did that experience teach you? You want me to do the question again? Okay, sorry. What was the hardest obstacle you've had to overcome in your journey, and what did that experience teach you?
Well, that's not an easy question to answer. The most obvious question, the most obvious answer, rather, to that question would be in 1970 when I was charged with murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy, and spent some time. It was a scary time. Running from the FBI, thinking every white man with a suit on was, now they probably, would not dress the same if they would. But anyway, that was a difficult time, especially because I was 26, 27 years old. But I did not know how much I did not know. And as the years have unfolded, I've recognized that the real sign of knowledge is the acknowledgement of what one does not know. And so the more I've learned, the more I've recognized what I don't know. But that was a scary time because it was totally unexpected. I had no idea that I was going to find myself in that situation. And I'll tell you something. I've mentioned this many times, and it may even be in my book. Around the time preceding my arrest, well, it's a long story because I had already been fired from my job at UCLA for being a member of the Communist Party, and I was working on the campaign to free George Jackson and the Soledad Brothers, and traveling up and down the state, speaking to people, urging them to join the movement to free the Soledad Brothers, and I would say to them, we are building this movement not only to try to free George and John and Fleda, but we're doing it to free ourselves. And we do not know who is going to be targeted next. And so join this movement because you may be the next one. And I had no idea that I was talking about myself. But I always remember that when I first went to jail, I had these invasive feelings, these invasive ideas, and I was charged with capital punishment 3 times. So I was imagining the gas chamber in San Quentin, which is where had I been put to death, that is where I would have been. And I kept imagining myself. You watch movies, so you see how the people are brought out of their cells and that long walk to the death chamber. So I couldn't help thinking about that. But as the movement began to grow and develop all over this country and literally all over the world, then I started to imagine it differently. And what had been fear turned into something more akin to courage in my imagination, because I realized that regardless of what the final outcome might be, that I would not be alone. And I had always been imagining myself taking that walk to the death chamber by myself. And I realized that there would be people walking with me, whatever happened. And so slowly that fear completely subsided. And slowly it wasn't really about what was going to happen to me, but it was about how to continue to build this movement in order to free others, and in order to do the transformative, revolutionary work we wanted to. So that was, I mean, in that sense, what for me was a really difficult time, I now see as a gift. And I got that from Erica Huggins. Erica Huggins, who's one of the leaders of the Black Panther Party, and she and I have been friends since 1967, I think, and we still live in the same neighborhood in Oakland. And so she also spent time in jail, and we wrote letters to each other. She was in New Haven. And so I once heard her speak about her time in jail, and she said that she realizes how much of a gift that was. And I said, yes, that's it, because that time in jail really became the foundation for all future trajectories. All of the political work that I've done around prison issues, abolition, my academic work. I've written many books and articles about prison. As a matter of fact, I'm getting ready to publish, I think, a 2-volume collection of writings that I have done over the years around prison issues. So, what could have been the very worst time in my life, I now think of as the most formative moment. And I write about that. Those of you who get the autobiography, you'll see the short preface, that 25-page preface that I wrote. Because, at first people were expecting me to revise it. And I read that book, and I said, oh my God, how could I have written that? And you were asking me how I've changed? I realized that my ideas have changed so much that I would have to write a new book. So I decided to leave it alone because it helps me to recognize that the very movement that I try to write about, my participation in that movement, in that book, has transformed me and my ways of thinking. For example, I had these very homophobic ideas about formations among women in jail. And if you read the book, you'll see there's a kind of a family system. And then I looked at the way I described that, and I hadn't read it. I don't like to read what I write, because I always, know that I'm going to have that kind of, I'm going to cringe at things, which I did. It was when I was in jail that I began to think seriously about, what we now call Black feminism. Before I went to jail, I thought my job was to free the Black man. I swear. We were all out there saying, free the Black man. And it was mostly women doing it, and we didn't even realize that we weren't even talking about ourselves. But that's what's so wonderful about charting the changes that are brought about precisely about movements. If then someone had ever told me that people would introduce themselves by talking about their pronouns, and if someone had said to the younger me that the trans movement would be having such enormous impact on our culture and our discourse and our capacity to challenge what we've always considered to be so normal, that would have been hard to recognize then. So, yeah, now I'm realizing that's how I should have answered the question that you asked in the first place, Michelle.
It comes around. So let's talk about the prison system for a minute. So you've labeled America's prison system a punishment industry that actually produces crime, right? So what do you mean by that? And, you know, what can be done to address it?
Well, you know, first of all, I want to give credit where it's due. Everybody's now familiar with the notion of abolishing the prison industrial complex, right? I mean, there's certain terms like prison industrial complex, abolition, that have begun to resonate recently. Now, I think the basis for developing these ideas came from people in prison. George Jackson, for example. He would argue that we had to do more than just talk about freedom for political prisoners, because that's kind of how we started. You know, we were calling for Huey Newton's freedom, Bobby Seale, Erica Huggins, and Lolita Lebron, and the Puerto Rican nationalists, and I can go on. Carlos Feliciano, the Attica brothers. I can, you know, go on and on talking about political prisoners. But what George argued at that time was that the prison, the system of the system of imprisonment was an example of racism. The institution itself was a racist institution. And that we had to begin to think about how the prison system furthered racism in so many different ways. And I think it was people behind bars who had that insight first. You know, we tend to think about people in prison as illiterate, and of course, many people never had the opportunity to get an education. But those who have managed to survive have generally survived by living the life of the mind. They have developed themselves as intellectuals, and they have developed precisely the insights that have allowed us to generate these analyses that have led to the whole notion of the prison industrial complex, the punishment industry, the notion of abolition, and so I just think it's so important to acknowledge how much intellectual capacity and intellectual energy there is among the hundreds of thousands, the 2 million people who are behind bars, and I think that the ideas that they have generated can help solve some of the major social problems on the outside. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we really need to fight for abolitionist strategies and decarcerating prisons. But Wow, I don't want to give a long lecture, so how can I? Oh, we'll be here until tomorrow. We have the lecture, but I do want to make the connection with slavery, because this is a period when we are involved in collective work, in not only in this country, but in Brazil, in the Caribbean, in South Africa, work of identifying structural racism and state violence. This is work that should have been done in the immediate aftermath of slavery. Because slavery was abolished, they say. But as Du Bois pointed out, it was impossible to abolish slavery as a discrete institution, because the impact of slavery was felt and continues to be felt throughout all of the institutions of the society, its culture, its discourse, and it's as if, yeah. It's as if you say, okay, yeah, let's get rid of the institution, but let's retain the substance and the meaning of slavery, and let that inform every aspect of our lives in this country. That is what has happened. So the work that we're doing right now, and in the 21st century, in the third decade of the 21st century, is work that should have been initiated in the immediate aftermath of the abolition of slavery. So let's keep that in mind. And that is why the two institutions that we've been attentive to, the police and the prison system, bear the imprint of slavery. They are evidence of the fact that we are still living the afterlife of slavery. And if one considers the forms of violence that have been incorporated into the practices of imprisonment, they've come from slavery. And if I had time, I would talk about the convict lease system and the ways in which the convict lease system, as scholars have pointed out, was even worse than slavery. I mean, there are books. There's a book that's called Worse Than Slavery. There's a book that's called One Dies, Get Another. Because in the immediate aftermath of slavery, they developed this convict lease system, which not only served to provide labor for the plantations from which black people who were enslaved had absconded, but at the same time, this convict lease system helped to industrialize the South. So when you talk about the steel industry in Birmingham, Alabama, that industry was created by people who had been former slaves or their descendants, and who were arrested precisely for the purpose of leasing them out as labor. And we've just begun to acknowledge that was one of the ways in which slavery was retained, even as it was abolished. And that became the heritage of the penitentiary system, first in the South, and then pretty much all over the country. And that means that there's a connection with capitalism from the beginning. And now I'll just, I know I can't give my whole lecture here. I have to remind myself. So I do want to point out that when we decided to introduce the term prison industrial complex, which actually came from Mike Davis, who's an urban theorist and had written a book about the way the the economy in California was being transformed from an agricultural economy into a prison economy. So he used that term in an article, and we decided to just borrow it. He agreed. He was at our conference that was called Critical Resistance Beyond the Prison Industrial Complex. And so the point that we made was that this punishment industry was linked to the economy, the larger economy, in so many ways. And it began to happen during the decade of the 80s. The decade of the 80s was precisely the period when global capitalism began to show a really ugly face. And I say ugly because what happened was that all of these institutions were dismantled that provided for people's needs. Like that's when you started seeing the privatization of healthcare. Because I can remember when you could go to any hospital and you weren't asked about your capacity to pay. They were first concerned with healing you, and then you could figure out, how to pay for it. And no longer the case. So the whole healthcare industry has been privatized. Around that time, there was also there was Hospital Corporations of America. That was one of the first capitalist healthcare corporations. And then they had the idea to create another corporation called Correctional Corporation of America with an interlocking directorate. So some of the same people involved in privatizing the healthcare system began to become involved in privatizing the prison system. But you see, the point that I'm making is that it's about profit, right? It's about making money. And a figure like Jeff Bezos in this country represents the ways in which wealth has been accumulated into ever smaller numbers of hands, and at the same time, what used to be available as a public good is nowhere to be seen. The whole economy is... Anyway, that's my anti-capitalist rant again.
I'll have one last question, and then I think I think they might open it up to the audience. Who are some of the leaders you admire, both either past or present, and why?
I admire so many people. I had the good fortune also to meet people who were major leaders and organizers, but not acknowledged, right? Because we only know the ones that get the media coverage, and that's not how the real work gets done. I mean, I have a great deal of admiration for Dr. King. As a matter of fact, I met him in an elevator in Atlanta when I was really young. I was at a conference there. I think I may have been 13 years old or something like that. And I went to many of his speeches, and although I have to admit I was a bit critical of of nonviolence as a philosophy, not as a strategy, because I think that our movements have to be nonviolent. But I also agreed that we had the right to defend ourselves, and so. But what I learned was that that I can embrace someone's ideas and be critical at the same time. It doesn't mean that I have to shove them away just because I have issues with their ideas. I mean, we're supposed to be engaged in that kind of critical conversation. So, yeah, I also met Malcolm X when I was in college, and because I was, there weren't that many black people. I went to Brandeis University in Boston. There were maybe about 6 or 7 of us on the whole campus. So that meant we all got to meet Malcolm. I could talk about Rosa Parks, and she's one of my, she's really, one of my heroes, and I'm using the word that's usually gendered as masculine, because not because of all of the things that she did that people don't know about, and we have to challenge the ways in which people who represent our history are represented in such. I don't know, how would you, they're simplistic. It's not just simplistic, but it is in order to fit into a narrative that affirms the United States of America as the, greatest democracy in the world. And so the civil rights movement is upheld, right? It's because they look at the civil rights movement and they say that the civil rights movement represents a triumph for American democracy. The last challenge was, we know that's not true, right? But Rosa Parks was doing work against gender violence. She was an investigator for Ku Klux Klan crimes and was involved in a major case that took place the year I was born, 1944, in a small town in Alabama, the state where I was born, called Abbeville, where a black woman by the name of Reese Taylor was gang raped by the Ku Klux Klan. Maybe some of you have heard about that because Oprah was talking about that for a while. Now, she was the investigator for the NAACP of that case. And what I find so interesting, I'm going to tell you why I think she's so significant. It is that, we still have a serious problem with gender violence. Gender violence is the most pandemic form of violence in the world. And we're not going to get rid of it only by pointing to individuals. The same problem we have with the cops, the assumption that, we just need better cops, right? Or let's make sure that each one that commits a crime is going to be rendered accountable. But we know that the structure is so deeply racist and so deeply violent that no matter how many individual cops we try to render accountable, the problem is going to remain. It is in the very structure of policing itself. The same thing is true of gender violence. No matter how many male figures, prominent male figures who are tried and convicted or sent to prison, that is not going to change the fact that gender violence is inscribed into the very structures of our society. And so the movement against gender violence has to learn something from the movement against racism. And Rosa Parks knew that in 1944. At the same time, she gets represented as a tired woman who didn't want to get up because, So anyway, I could continue to tell you about many other people who've inspired me, but that's an example. And by the way, let me make this point. because the work of communists has been erased. And I mean, I used to be a member of the Communist Party. I still consider myself a communist with a small c. And during the period of the 30s and the 40s, black communists and also white communists worked in the South against racism. Nobody tells us that. And as a matter of fact, that case that I was talking about of Recy Taylor in Abbeville, Alabama, it was taken up by the Southern Negro Youth Congress, which was a formation that was created by black communists in the South. W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the main figures who inspired young black people, black communists, to organize it. And my mother was a member of that organization. She was never a communist, but her best friends were communists. And so that's where I kind of, you understand me a little bit better when I tell you that. But they did the work that laid the groundwork for what we call the civil rights movement. And as a matter of fact, I was about to say that case of Recy Taylor led to the creation of an organization in Alabama that eventually became the Montgomery Improvement Association. And that was the organization that was the organizational form that the boycott, Montgomery boycott took. So yeah, there's we could have spent the entire time, talking about that issue and the fact that that kids don't learn that. I mean, they're so upset about critical race theory. But I think what they're really upset about is the fact that kids of all racial backgrounds will learn the true history of our country. And let me just conclude by saying, did you all see on social media that little white girl who, and they were talking about having to prevent courses being taught in schools that would make white children feel guilty? You remember that? And the little girl said something about, well, if they're against racism, they don't have anything to feel guilty about. And I said, out of the mouths of babes.
Well, I think we have time for just a couple of questions. Thank you, Dr. Taylor, for moderating our conversation. And birthday blessings to our great Congresswoman. Today's her 50th birthday. So one question, let's see here. Anybody have a question? We'll give you a free book too. Stand up.
Hi, welcome to Wilmington. I just want to touch on one piece of your biography. Your ardent opposition to capitalism, which my son would endorse completely. I wish he was here. But you went to the Soviet Union, got a Medal of Freedom or whatever. You went to East Germany. You went to Cuba. Do you regard those as acts of naivete or knowing what we know about those systems and the subjugation of people and the loss of human capacity those systems inflicted? Do you still endorse those trips? Okay. I knew we were going to have to deal with some anti-communism here. There is never a perfect social system. And socialism as it existed prior to 1991, what was often called the socialist community of nations, of course had problems. But
But I'm someone who always argues that one can be critical and at the same time one can see, what is good and productive and transformative. And I certainly believe that the socialism, even with all of the problems of countries like the Soviet Union or the German Democratic Republic and Cuba, which is still a socialist country, is so much better than what we have in the United States of America today. And I'm saying that because, let me just tell you a story. That'll help me to be more concise. A young friend of mine, I guess we were in our 20s, and this is a white friend who was a member of the Communist Party. She was poor. She was a single mother. But she wanted to study. She wanted to go to the university. She wanted to get a graduate degree. And there was no way that she could do that in this country because she would, first of all, she would have to have child care. Second of all, she would have to figure out how to pay for the education because education is totally commodified here. In any event, she actually ended up moving to Moscow. She had free health care there. Her apartment cost a fraction of well, actually, she got free housing because she was admitted to the university. And she ended up doing her undergraduate work and getting a PhD in anthropology and writing remarkable books. And this is somebody, she was white, but she was very poor. And there was no hope for her in this country. So I'm saying that any place that is attentive to the needs of human beings, why cannot we in this country place more of our attention on how to figure out how to feed people and house people and give them free education? So I understand that there were problems, yes, but I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. That's the point that I'm making. I'm still hoping. Okay, if you would like to come up and instruct people about whatever it is, I don't even know who had that outburst there, but
we've got.
But all I'm suggesting is that it is possible to be critical and at the same time to recognize that there is something that we have to hold on to if we want to imagine a future in which the needs of human beings are attended to, a future in which capitalism doesn't destroy this planet.
Good evening. My question for you is, I was listening to a speech of yours from the 70s. I think it was entitled Oppression and Repression. And you talked about this looming threat of fascism. And I guess my question to you is, because a lot of your key points that you were dropping in that speech back in the 70s, I think a lot of those really subtle warning signs are happening today right under our noses, and we're not really paying attention to it. Part of it is because we're arguing semantics. We're arguing about billions of people being slaughtered and forgetting, romanticizing with the history right here, that millions of people were slaughtered right here in a short amount of history. Millions of people were slaughtered on the way here in a short amount of history. Millions of people were slaughtered before even getting on a boat. We don't talk about the King of Belgium and the Congo. We don't talk about those holocausts. But we're critical of every other country who takes care of their elderly, their poor. But we're worried about the names of things. But all of those deaths and murders happened under democracy, the name of democracy, and capitalism. And freedom and the pursuit of somebody's happiness who thought, if to make me happy, I have to put my boot on the back of your neck and make you a fraction of a man or a woman. So my question to you is, I just wanted to put that, because I'm going to defend my heroes. I'm going to defend mine, especially the black woman. I'm a defender. You can argue semantics with her all you want. I'm the right one. She don't have to say another word. We could do this all night. But this is about you though, Queen. I just wanted to know, do you feel that those same, because I'm seeing it, I smell it, it's in everything that we see, it's very subtle, and you spoke very eloquently on it. Do you still think in the year 2022 that fascism is a looming threat?
Okay, well, first of all, let me thank you. But also, I am more than willing to engage in debate and dialogue, and I think that although the comment that was made is reminiscent of maybe 40, 50 years ago. And you're absolutely right. I can remember we were all talking about the threat of fascism. And that threat of fascism back then in the 70s materialized during this period. Fascism was in the White House. As a matter of fact, when we voted for Biden, that was a vote to evict fascism from the White House. And I just want to use this opportunity to say that, we have this very bad habit of thinking that all we have to do is go and elect someone and then everything's going to be okay. And the whole point of evicting the person whose name I will not mention because I really do not want it to pollute our conversations this evening. The whole point of voting for Biden was to clear space so we could do something else. It was not because we thought Biden was going to lead us to freedom, but because we have to do the work of calling out the fascism that relies on racism. And let me just say, we were talking about all of the slaughters that have happened. I am really upset that those of us who think we represent the future, the progressive future of this country, have not had the kind of internationalist sensibility that would make us aware of the fact that we can't only be concerned about what happens in the United States of America. We have to stand with our comrades and our sisters and brothers in South Africa and Haiti and Brazil and, all over the world. And I'm thinking right now about Afghanistan. How come we haven't been involved in protesting the degree to which the people of Afghanistan have been left with absolutely nothing? And I'm a little bit nostalgic because I can remember, when Dr. King gave that amazing speech at Riverside Church on Vietnam, Vietnam beyond, what was it called? Beyond Vietnam, breaking the silence. And he pointed out that it was as important to struggle against the war in Vietnam as it was to try to begin to create an egalitarian society here in this country. And we seem to have forgotten that message. And we're not talking about what's happening in Iraq and the damage that the U.S. military did to Iraq. And we're not talking about what's happening in Haiti. And as a matter of fact, the history of black people in this country would not be what it is if it hadn't been for the example of the Haitian Revolution. Haiti was the second independent nation in the Americas, and it was a black nation. It was a black nation with a constitution that was the only non-racial constitution, the only non-racial democracy, constitutional democracy in the world. It wasn't the U.S., it wasn't France, it was Haiti. That was the beacon of light. I mean, of course, a lot of terrible things happen. And we just allow people like the person whose name I said I didn't want to pollute our discussion by mentioning, to talk about that as a SH country. Oh, you remember the what he was saying, and not recalling that the reason Haiti is so poor is because after their revolution, they were forced to pay the price of people who had been enslaved. They were forced to pay the slaveholders. They were forced to pay the money lenders, including Citibank of New York, right? And it took them 50 years to pay what amounted to billions and billions of dollars. So why is that country poor? Well, anyway, you understand what I'm saying. I'm making this plea because we can't pretend that we live in a vacuum. And we have to recognize that our fate, as Dr. King pointed out, is linked to the mutual destiny of the world, and if we can't start being attentive, to what's happening in other countries where structural racism is also a problem, because colonialism and slavery were global, and colonialism and slavery provided the foundation for the capitalism that defines the way we live today. It's racial capitalism. Capitalism is racial capitalism. Okay, so let me stop my rant.
Hi, I'm Damani. I came with Network Connect today, and my question is,
That's okay. You want to come closer?
oh no. What's your advice for someone my age?
How old are you?
A young activist. I'm 15.
Oh, wow. She's 15. So her question is, what is my advice for someone her age? And where are you?
There, she moved right over there, back there.
Oh, okay. Well, the hands, the future of the world is in your hands. And it's always been the case that young people have been in the forefront of change because they're closer to both to the future we want to prevent and the future we want to imagine and embrace and forge. And I was thinking that that we hadn't yet really gestured towards the environmental damage that is linked to racism and linked to heteropatriarchy. And young people have a much more profound sensibility with respect to what is happening to the climate, because this is your environment. And if this environment is destroyed, then that means that your future goes up in flames. And I think that what a feminist often call intersectionality, and you're familiar with that term, right? But it's really only about the interconnectedness of things, the interrelationalities, that it is impossible to talk about struggling against racism without attending to all of the other damage that capitalism does. And so I think that the youth movements all over the world are the future. So just remember that, and that you are strong and you are powerful, and always remember that you're not alone. I think that's the most important message. We have so much mental illness now, and I would say that it is in part due to the ideological assumption that we're all supposed to be powerful individuals. We're encouraged to think of ourselves as being by ourselves, not as deeply connected with others. And so I just want to encourage you to build community. Wherever you go, create community. Don't go anywhere by yourself. Always be sure that someone has your back. And you see, this is why I think we've been so successful over the centuries in keeping the movement for Black liberation going. Because if you stop and think about it, we've been at this for something like 500 years, almost 500 years, if you consider that there was a slave rebellion in the 1520s, right? And probably no one could have predicted that 500 years later, that impulse for freedom would still be burning in the hearts of African-descended people everywhere. And this is why Black history is not just for Black people, because it captures the human desire for freedom. And if Black people could pass down this impulse to struggle from one generation to the next over and over and over again, I mean, we need to think about that all the time, that we are here only because of the fact that our ancestors have valued the struggle for freedom, have valued freedom and democracy to the extent that they've been willing to die for it and to die for us. And so, you know, whenever I feel down, whenever I feel like, you know, we're not moving as fast as we should, I think about that. And this struggle is not going anywhere. It's going to be with us. You know, maybe 500 years from now. I mean, I hope that we deal with the basic things by then. It shouldn't take that long. But the whole idea that even as we struggle, we become aware of new dimensions of freedom. And I think that is going to be an infinite process. So I look at you and I smile. And I think that you are going to usher us into a wonderful future.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out to the Wilmington Public Library for this event. Ms. Davis, we just want to thank you on the behalf of our library for taking the time out to come see us. That concludes our evening. Thank you so much. One last round of applause, everyone. If you can stay seated for us, please, everyone. Unless you are exiting the building, please stay seated if you'd like to stay for the book signing event, or portion, should I say. We'll give you instructions in one moment. Please bear with us.
It was nice meeting you.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much.
You were amazing. And funny. People tell you funny. Okay, just follow her down.
Please stay seated. Please stay seated. Please stay seated.
Everyone, please stay seated for us, please. All right. If you are staying for the book signing, we will go ahead and let you guys out by rows. You will see someone else with a library staff lanyard. When they come and tap you on your shoulder for your row, you may go. So we will exit to my right, and you will head to the circulation desk, which will have the books there for you, okay? They are $20, and we will accept cash or credit card.
Hello, everyone. This is Bakari Sellers. I am a commentator at CNN, and even more importantly, I'm a new children's book author of Who Are Your People? As we know, February begins Black History Month. And with the beginning of Black History Month and to celebrate at the Wilmington Public Library, we'll be giving away free copies of my book, Who Are Your People? It's a book of inspiration. It's a book of hope. It teaches us to be proud of who we are, and the representation and the images on the pages is dynamic. Also, February 17th, I will be there with the one and only Ernest Green, a legendary civil rights icon who still walks among us. We have to give people their flowers while they are living. Of the Little Rock Nine, he is one of the 9 individuals who helped to desegregate Little Rock Central High School in 1957. So join me in Delaware in person at 6 p.m. on February 17th for this amazing event. And don't forget to bring your mask. February 1st, you can start picking up this book, Who Are Your People? I look forward to seeing you all very soon. And shout out to the Wilmington Public Library.
Hello, Wilmington. I'm singer-songwriter Kenny Lattimore. You may know me from my song, For You I'd Give a Lifetime of Stability. All I do is for you. Well, first I'd like to wish the Wilmington Public Library a very happy 100th birthday. I want you, though, to come out and join me at the Wilmington Public Library in Wilmington, Delaware for their Dancing with the Stars 100th Anniversary Gala on Friday, March the 4th at 6 p.m. All you have to do, register for the event below, okay? I'll see you there.